Welcome. My name is Marian Taylor. I'm a professor of Old Testament at Wycliffe College in Toronto. Esther has been one of my favorite Old Testament books for a very long time. Early in my career, I was asked to write study notes for the New Geneva Bible on the book of Esther. And that experience of diving deep into the book of Esther brought me face to face with its many challenges. It also convinced me of its importance in the story of God. I have also had the privilege of teaching the book of Esther in the introduction course that I teach every year. And when I started teaching a course called Bad Girls in the Bible, I was excited to have the students wrestle with the question of whether Vashti and Esther should be on the list of bad girls or even really bad girls in the Bible. That being said, I'm really excited about this series on the book of Esther. And I'm sure that at the end of our time together, you will agree with me that the book of Esther is a challenging book, an exciting book, and an inspiring book all at the same time. As we begin our study of the book of Esther, there are a number of introductory issues that we need to consider. The book of Esther, found in Bibles used by Protestants, is a relatively short book of 10 chapters that translate the Hebrew version of the book of Esther. It takes about a half an hour to read or listen to it. And I encourage you to do that before each of our sessions, as it will help you get a sense of the whole that allows you to see how the various parts fit together. I also encourage you to listen to different translations of Esther and to different voices reading Esther, as you will find that you hear new things every time you listen to this book. And if you're a person who likes to do research, I urge you to find out all you can about the history and archaeology of ancient Persia. The United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, better known by its acronym UNESCO, has a description, maps, and a marvelous gallery of images of finds from ancient Susa, which is the city in Iran where Xerxes had his winter capital. And if you like fine art, you might also enjoy finding artistic representations of Queen Vashti, Esther, Mordecai, and King Xerxes, who's called King Ahasuerus in many Bibles. And you can ask yourself whether their representations fit what we know about ancient Persia and the story of Esther. To begin, we will consider the question of the book's title. The book of Esther is one of two Old Testament books named after a woman, the other being Ruth. But even the book's earliest commentators wonder why the book was named after Esther and not Mordecai, given the fact that Mordecai figures prominently in the book's last chapter, which does not even mention Esther. I like the explanation that the 3rd century Christian theologian Hippolytus gave as to why the book is named after Esther, who had done one thing only, while Mordecai did many. He wrote, "The reason is that Esther as queen offered her life for the protection of the children of Israel, who then were persecuted, and on account of her good deed and the faith which she had in God, she was held worthy to be honored as the principal accomplisher of the deed. Thus, the book is entitled Esther." But what about the question of why and when the book of Esther was written? The first question is easy. There is very little debate about why the book of Esther was written. Simply put, it was written to give an account of the origin of the popular Jewish festival called Purim, that celebrates the victory of the Jews over those who tried to wipe them out. The question of who wrote the book is also straightforward. We simply do not know who wrote the Hebrew book of Esther. The question of dating, however, is much more complicated. First of all, it's important to note that the book of Esther contains a number of clues that suggest that the book was put together after the events of the story. In chapter 9, for example, we find several accounts of how the Jews celebrated their victory over those who hated them. These accounts suggest that it took a long time to finalize the details about how Purim should be celebrated. Similarly, chapter 10 talks about things that Xerxes and Mordecai had accomplished in the past that had been written down in the book of the Annals of the Kings of Media and Persia. Such clues suggest that the book was written sometime after the actual events narrated in the book. The question of how long after Xerxes' assassination in 465 BC the book was written continues to be debated. Some date the book's initial composition to the late 5th or 4th century BC. The evidence to support this early dating includes the author's intimate knowledge of the capital city Susa and the organization and administration of the Persian court, as well as the book's stylistic features. Others date the Book of Esther much later. Some argue for the 3rd century, others the 2nd, and still others for the 1st century BC. Arguments for this later dating of Esther are very complicated. They involve arguments about the book's genre, language, ideas, and theology. The question of the dating of the Hebrew version of Esther that we will be reading is intertwined with debates about the dating of the very important Greek version of Esther called the Septuagint. It is this longer version of Esther that is found in Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox Bibles. The Septuagint Esther concludes with the statement that dates the book's arrival in the Egyptian city of Alexandria to the 4th year of the reign of Ptolemy and Cleopatra. Although you might think that this colophon would give us a firm date for this very influential Greek version of Esther that could help us date the Hebrew version, it doesn't, because there were many Ptolemies and Cleopatras in power in Egypt in the 2nd and 1st century BC. So now you know that there were at least 2 early versions of the story of Esther, the short 10-chapter Hebrew version and the Greek version called the Septuagint. Let me tell you a little bit more about these 2 important versions of Esther. The short Hebrew version of Esther that is found in Protestant Bibles lacks religious language. It does not explicitly mention God. It does not even mention prayer, miracles, the covenant, or promises of land, blessing, and progeny given to the patriarchs. The Greek Septuagint is longer and more explicitly religious. God is present in the story. Esther and Mordecai are pious Jews, and their prayers are actually included in the story. The Septuagint Esther reminds us of the book of Daniel. It opens with Mordecai's apocalyptic dream that begins with noises and confusions, thunder and earthquakes, and a tumult on the earth. And soon 2 roaring dragons appear who are ready to fight. It ends with the interpretation of Mordecai's wild dream. I encourage you to read this longer version of Esther sometime. It fills in many of the puzzling theological gaps that we see in the shorter Hebrew version. It may surprise you that Christians read the longer, theologically rich version of the book of Esther before the time of the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, when books not originally written in Hebrew, like the longer Greek version of Esther and the book of Judith, were excluded from the Old Testament. These are known as apocryphal books and are still included in Catholic and Orthodox Bibles. If you have a Bible that has this longer version of Esther, you will likely find that the 6 additions to the short Hebrew version are placed in an appendix. The 5th century biblical scholar Jerome, who translated the Bible into Latin, was the guy responsible for putting the Greek additions into an appendix, which is now called the Additions to Esther. And these additions are labeled A to F. At this point, I will simply mention that there are two more surviving early Greek versions of Esther. The first is known as Alpha, or A text, and the second is Josephus's retelling of the Esther story, which you can read in his famous 20-volume work called The Antiquities of the Jews. Like the Septuagint, these Greek versions share the basic plot line of the story of Esther found in the shorter Hebrew version. They also embellish this story to make God present rather than hidden or at work behind the scenes. These multiple Greek versions suggest that Esther's story was very popular and passed on in both oral and written forms over the centuries within various communities of faith. All these Greek versions recognized the theological gaps in the story and filled them in different ways. You may be relieved that we're going to focus on the short 10-chapter Hebrew version of Esther. But I do encourage you strongly to read one of these longer versions of Esther for the sake of comparison. Another related issue that we really need to talk about is the place of Esther in the canon of Scripture. Given that the Hebrew version of the book of Esther lacks the kind of religious language that we would expect in a biblical book, you won't be surprised to learn that Jews and Christians debated for centuries about whether Esther should be in the canon. In spite of the popularity of the festival of Purim among the Jews debated about whether Esther should be in the canon into the 3rd century of the Christian era. Christians also engaged in heated deliberations about whether Esther should be in the canon. Debates about Esther among Christians in the West continued until the end of the 4th century AD, and in the East, disputes continued for another century. But even after Esther was included in the canon, Christians continued to wrestle with questions about how to preach, teach, and live the book of Esther. Very few early Christian reflections on Esther remain, and I'm sure it will surprise you, as it did me, that it was not until the 9th century AD that the first full commentary on Esther was written. When the Protestant Church decided to accept the shorter version of Esther that has a very secular feel about it, questions about Esther's value resurfaced. In the collection of Martin Luther's writings called Table Talk, Luther expressed extreme hostility towards the books of 2nd Maccabees and Esther. He said, "I wish they did not exist at all, for they Judaize greatly and have much pagan impropriety." Luther was not alone in wondering how to preach and teach a book that features the hiddenness of God and that doesn't criticize the vengeful acts of Mordecai and Esther and the other Jews, and is so difficult to tie into the gospel without using forced allegory or typology. Neither Luther nor Calvin published commentaries on Esther. And even today, some readers share Luther's hostility toward the book. I am not one of them. Like many other Christians today, I believe that Esther is a book that deserves fresh attention. I share the conviction of Canadian theologian Lee Beach that Esther is particularly valuable to the church today, as it wrestles with questions about how to survive and thrive in a post-Christian context that resembles that of the exiled Jews in the Persian Empire. I think that the book of Esther helps us learn what mission and church can look like in a foreign culture. Certainly, my recent experiences of reading Esther with students from a wide variety of denominations and cultural backgrounds have further convinced me that the book of Esther is a life-giving book for the global church of the 21st century. It is a book that we need to read within its historical and canonical contexts, with insights drawn from our faithful foremothers and forefathers, as well as contemporary voices. I love how 19th century author Elizabeth Rundle Charles describes the book of Esther as a sacred story that does not gossip about the external facts, but penetrates to the divine and human meanings enfolded in these. In the sessions ahead, I hope we too can penetrate the divine and human meanings enfolded in what I too believe is the sacred story of Esther. Well, now that we've talked about the most difficult aspects of the book of Esther, we're going to move on to more solid ground as we look at the narrative art of the book, which everyone marvels at, even people who share Luther's hostility toward the book. First, we will consider the book's structure. Given the book's purpose of explaining the origins of a festival that involves a lot of eating and excessive drinking, it seems fitting that Esther is structured around 10 paired eating and drinking banquets. The book begins with 2 elaborate banquets that highlight the king's extravagance and wealth. They are followed by 2 women's banquets, Queen Vashti's banquet for women in chapter 1, verse 9, and Esther's wedding banquet in chapter 2:18. The next set of banquets celebrate the edict of death for the Jews in chapter 3:15, and the counter edict of death to the enemies of the Jews in chapter 8:17. Then in the middle of the book, in chapters 5 and 7, Esther hosts a double set of banquets that form a bracket around chapter 6, which marks the turning point in the story. Finally, in chapter 9, we read about 2 days of feasting that accompanied Purim. These 10 paired sets of banquets stress the importance of festive eating and drinking, and poignantly contrast the book's theme of fasting that is introduced after the news of the genocidal edict in chapter 4. This fasting theme surfaces again when Esther calls for a 3-day fast before she dares to approach the king in chapter 4, verse 16, and when Esther insists that fasting be included as part of Purim celebrations in chapter 9, verse 31. In addition to these 10 paired banquets that hold the book together, the book has a structuring feature called a chiasm. A chiasm is a literary term that comes from the Greek letter chi, which looks like an X. In a chiasm, the sequence of ideas or events are set out as A, B, and C, and then repeated in reverse order as C primed, B primed, and A primed. And the result is a mirror effect. A particularly significant event, theme, or idea is often placed at the center of this X or chiasm. The book of Esther has this kind of chiastic structure, and strikingly at the center of the chiasm, we find the sudden turn of events that precipitates a reversal in the fate of the Jews and the roles and positions of Haman and Mordecai. It is a reversal that brings life and not death. As you read the book of Esther, you will also note that it is filled with repetitions. These repetitions are never accidental. Let me give you a few examples of the kind of repetitions that you will see scattered throughout the book. The first is the threefold mention of the size of Xerxes' empire. The book's first verse tells us that Xerxes ruled from Ethiopia to India over 127 provinces. The same details are repeated in chapter 8, verse 9. And then in chapter 10, verse 1, we read that the king imposed a tax on the land and isles of the sea, which is an unusual expression meant to signify the whole world. These repeated expressions of the vastness of the Persian Empire bookend the story that features a powerful but inept king of an enormous empire. Also repeated 3 times at key points in the story are references to an official book of royal records. Xerxes' promise to Esther of up to half the kingdom is also repeated twice in chapter 5 and again in chapter 7. This book that is filled with repetitions also overflows with word pairs that reflect the kind of formal and typically verbose style of writing that characterized official Persian documents. In Chapter 1, which talks a lot about the court and legal procedures, for example, we find 24 verbal doublets that are sometimes masked in English translations. The most striking example of a double is the repeated name of the king in the book's first verse, which says in Hebrew, "This is what happened during the time of Xerxes, the Xerxes who ruled over 127 provinces." In many other doublets, synonyms are used, as in the expression in chapter 1, verse 4, "the splendor and glory of his majesty," or in verse 12, "the king became furious and burned with anger." The repeated words are also found in longer sequences of 3 or 4 synonyms. Examples include the triplet, destroy, kill, and annihilate, that is found in 3 places in the book, and the 4-fold repeated idea, happiness and joy, gladness and honor, that we see in chapter 8, verse 16. The lists of the names of 7 eunuchs, the 7 wise men, and Haman's 10 sons also reflect the style typical of court records. In addition to paying attention to the narrative art of the book of Esther, it is important to read the book in its historical context, which is Persia in the 5th century BC. The book of Esther introduces us to a community of Jews living in the city of Susa, which was the king's winter capital city. It was in Susa that the evil scheme to kill all the Jews in the entire Persian Empire was hatched and eventually overturned. Excavations at what is now a UNESCO heritage site in the modern Iranian city of Shush confirm the monumental nature of the Persian royal buildings at Susa and bear witness to Xerxes' wealth and power. The Jews, you may remember, had been exiled to Babylon in 597 and 586 BC. The writings of Old Testament prophets like Jeremiah and Ezekiel describe the trauma God's people endured as they witnessed the destruction of Jerusalem before being taken into captivity, where they served a number of Neo-Babylonian kings, until Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon and founded the Persian Empire in 539 BC. Life changed for God's people under Cyrus because he put policies of religious freedom in place that allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple, as the first chapter of Ezra explains. However, the vast majority of Jews chose either to remain in Babylon or to move further east to Susa. And the story of Esther belongs to this particular period in the history of God's people. The ruling king at the time of Esther's story was called Ahasuerus in Hebrew. Most scholars identify him as Xerxes I, who ruled from 485 to 465 BC. We know a lot about Xerxes from the writings of Greek historians. Herodotus's history is especially valuable, as Herodotus devotes about a third of his works to Xerxes' wars with the Greeks. Like the narrator of Esther, Herodotus loved to criticize and mock the excesses of the Persian Empire and its rulers. Herodotus's description of Xerxes as an impulsive, tyrannical king who loved women and alcohol lines up with the king we meet in Esther. Ancient writings also help us understand Persian culture, customs, and attitudes that we find embedded in the book of Esther. For example, ancient writings shed light on Persian attitudes toward women, genocide, slavery, castration, record keeping, and the ancient practice of assigning symbolic meanings to colors, accessories, and actions. Archaeological finds have also been very helpful. The architectural remains of Persian gardens and palaces and sculptures portraying kings and courts add credibility to the story and help situate it in its ancient context. Even artifacts, such as the ancient perfume burners, help us to imagine what was going on during the 12 months the harem girls spent preparing for their one-night stand with the king. Many biblical texts also provide relevant commentary on the book of Esther. Some fill in missing pieces in the story about the intense hatred between Mordecai and Haman. Others help us to understand Israelite practices of holy war and ancient rituals of mourning and fasting. Still others encourage us to read the book of Esther as an important yet unfinished chapter in the larger story of God. Reading Esther within the context of Scripture helps us to hear the whispers of God in the story. This larger context opens up the rich theological readings of the book that many of our forefathers and mothers discerned that are being explored again today. While it's true that ancient texts and artifacts provide information that helps us to read Esther within its historical context, it must be acknowledged that a number of historical challenges remain. Let me just mention one: the problem that Esther is not mentioned outside of the Bible. According to Herodotus, Xerxes was married to Amestris, a queen who lived into her old age. Some scholars try to solve this historical anomaly by suggesting that Vashti was a title or a nickname for Amestris. But there's no historical evidence that Xerxes' wife had more than one name or that she was deposed. Others suggest that Amestris was actually Esther based on the similarity of their names. But this idea does not fit with Herodotus' description of Amestris as a woman who buried 14 children alive as an offering to the god of the underworld. Still others wrestling with this historical problem suggest that Xerxes married Esther during a period of his reign not covered in Herodotus' histories. But this proposal raises a further historical concern. That is to say, Persian royalty normally married women from high-ranking families, not young harem girls. But, as the Greek historian Plutarch suggests, there were exceptions that allowed royals to marry for love, and Xerxes' marriage to an unusually beautiful harem girl may simply have been such an exception. Historical challenges, like those surrounding the identity of Esther, have convinced some that Esther is a work of fiction. However, even scholars who consider Esther a work of fiction acknowledge many points of historical convergence. Indeed, when Esther is read in its ancient context, perplexing details, such as Xerxes' astonishingly long 180-day banquet and his outrageous offer of up to half the kingdom, are shown to be historically credible. Perhaps more significantly, reading the book of Esther within its ancient context as a sacred story, and not a story that simply gossips about external facts, helps us evaluate what I think are some of the bad interpretations of the book of Esther that are out there. One of the most offensive presents Esther as a Disney princess who finds her Prince Charming. Another describes her as an unfaithful Jewish whore who slept with the king before she was married. An even bigger issue that we face as Christian readers of Esther centers around the question of how to hear God speak in a book that does not mention God overtly. This is not a new problem. Even during the centuries in which Christians read the longer version of Esther that fills in many of the theological gaps in the shorter Hebrew version, they did not give the book of Esther the kind of prominence that Jews did. The 12th century Torah scholar known as Rambam, for example, loved the book of Esther and suggested that it be ranked next to the Torah in importance. When early and medieval Christians did comment on Esther, they used a variety of interpretive methods to find its hidden moral and spiritual senses. In about 100 AD, Clement of Rome used what we call an exemplary approach, which reads Scripture looking for examples or models that Christians should follow. Clement presented Esther as a model of piety and courage. He described her as perfect in faith and suggested that after God saw the meekness of her soul, he rescued the people for whose sake she had faced danger. Esther also became a popular example of such virtues as wisdom, courage, and female agency in the writings of both men and women, and her speeches were set forth as models to follow. 15th century writer Lucrezia Tornabuoni, who was married to the de facto ruler of Florence, encouraged Christian noblewomen to use indirect means to persuade their husbands to do what they thought was needed, just as Esther had done. Tornabuoni viewed Vashti's more direct approach as less helpful. She wrote, "Women learn nothing from this queen. Be prudent and listen to my words with great care and discretion." In the 4th century, the Syrian writer Aphrahat used another very popular approach to interpreting Scripture that we call a figural approach. He read Esther's story in light of the New Testament, looking for parallels, types, or analogies that allowed him to talk about the gospel message in Esther. Because Mordecai, like Jesus, had been persecuted and was involved in saving God's people, Aphrahat presented Mordecai as a type of Christ. Similarly, he viewed Esther as a figure of the church, and the powerful Persian king Xerxes as a figure of God, and the rejected Queen Vashti as an outsider. Exemplary and figural approaches to interpreting Esther dominated Christian readings of Esther before the Reformation. Figural readings of Esther declined after Protestants adopted the shorter version of the book of Esther at the time of the Reformation. Many reformers were critical of typological and allegorical readings of Esther. Calvin expressed his contempt for those he thought tortured Scripture by beating out allegories they imagined lay under the outer bark of the letter or literal historical sense of Scripture. The shift away from figural readings was significant, but not absolute, and even today, many preachers continue to use a figural approach to discern the spiritual sense of Esther. As I mentioned earlier, Luther was not the only Christian who felt hostility towards the book of Esther. Princeton's famous Old Testament scholar Bernard Anderson described Esther as an earthy book. In 1950, he wrote, "Surely this book is of earth, earthy. And as we turn to it from other books of the Bible, we fall, as it were, from heaven to earth." As we read Esther together, we will have to ask if Anderson is right when he describes Esther as earthy or fallen. We will also consider what I think is a more faithful reading of the book of Esther. It considers Esther as much more than earthy, and in fact, a profoundly theological book that continues to speak into our lives today. Let me just say at this point that new discoveries, new approaches, and new insights have changed how we read the book of Esther. Many post-Holocaust, postmodern, and globally aware readers now call us to read Esther with fresh eyes and appreciate its relevance for today. We now recognize similarities between Esther's world and ours. We recognize Xerxes in the impulsive, egocentric tyrants ruling empires today. We encounter vile Hamans who are bent on destroying God's people. The global Me Too movement that emerged in 2017 draws increased attention to issues raised in Esther related to the abuse of power, the objectification of women, and sex trafficking. We can empathize with the Jews' responses to the genocidal edict because the Holocaust and subsequent genocides in Cambodia, Rwanda, Iraq, Syria, Darfur, and most recently Myanmar remind us of humanity's capacity to plan and carry out annihilation of those who are racially and religiously different. We recognize in ourselves and others the human capacity for evil, vengeance, and violence. Like the Jews in the story, we often experience our world as a place where God is hidden, and only hindsight allows us to recognize coincidences as signs of God's providence. Other new approaches to reading biblical texts cast additional light on Esther's story. Reading Esther through the lens of disaster and trauma studies, for example, brings both new theological insights and challenges. When we regard the doubly orphaned Esther as a victim and survivor of trauma, we can appreciate her actions and reactions in new light. To conclude, let me just say that I'm looking forward to reading Esther with you. I'm sure that it's going to be both challenging and exciting. We will be reading Esther within its ancient context. Then we will use a variety of interpretive methods and draw on insights of ancient and modern writers to help us discern the book's divine and human meanings. Let me just encourage you to take some time to read the book of Esther before we jump right into the first action-filled chapter, which introduces Xerxes and his wife Vashti, who is quickly deposed, an action which makes room for the young Jewish orphan Esther, who for such a time as this dared to risk her life to save the Jews from genocide. The story of Esther's willingness to step up to the plate to save her people for such a time as this is not locked into the past. Rather, it arches into the future, as Jesus too faced such a time as this, when he said, "My hour has come." That hour meant that Jesus died so that we might have life. He was crucified and rose from the dead so that we too might rise to new life in him for eternity.